everyone. Welcome to this week's podcast at Home Church. We're so glad to have you today. We're really honored today to have Pastor Joe Champion with us. Pastor Joe is my pastor. Of course, my name is Pastor Jake Mullen, and Pastor Joe and Lori have been our pastors and are our pastors, and we're so thankful for them. And we have a few minutes just to talk life and ministry and beginnings and where we are today. And we're so thankful to have you, Pastor Joe. Thank you for being with us today.
It's great to be back in the real world of Canada. You know, America's got a lot of things happening, but coming back home. I was actually born in Vancouver, so I'm back in my home country.
Glad to have you here. Pastor Joe, tell me, how did you come to Christ? What is your story?
Well, my mom and dad, when I was born, they were living in Vancouver. In 1964, my mom and dad met in college, and then after college, my dad began his football career as a player, and then went into coaching. And his first professional job was with the BC Lions. And when I was born there in 64, by then, Mom and Dad were primarily on the weekends done with church. Not that they were ever that involved in church. My mother was raised Catholic, Dad was raised Baptist, but Sunday mornings, whether that was in the Canadian Football League stadium or in the NFL, eventually my dad went to the NFL and lived all over the U.S. But Mom and Dad's world did not revolve around church or around God, although you could put them probably in a God-fearing category. They were respectful.
Right.
They would have probably told you that Christ was the Lord, but he was also somewhat distant or impersonal and not that relevant. And I think both of them had some experiences in church growing up that kind of disconnected them from a vibrant relationship to Christ. And even growing up, when I would hear about neighbors going to church, or whether that be at Christmas and Easter, I would ask them, how come we don't go?
Right.
And they would say things like, well, we plan, personally, if you want to go, we'll help you get there, and we will not discourage you. We want you to find out your own path and your own direction. And with all that being said, Dad and Mom used to say, well, we have no intentions of going the week after Christmas, so you don't mess with God. You either give God your all or you don't give him anything.
Wow.
And honestly, without them even being intentional about it, they were teaching me the fear of the Lord and to reverence him. And
That's
so
amazing.
Two players, Greg Berzine and Ralph Ortega, 1978, were the first two. They were both NFL linebackers, longtime NFL linebackers in the NFL, and they brought me to the dorm room after practice and said, we want to talk to you tonight about something. And there they had a Bible for me, and they preached the gospel to me at 14 for about 2 hours. And then I went back to my room during training camp, got on my knees and asked Christ to be the Lord of my life.
Wow.
So that was the first seed that was sown.
Amazing.
At 14, yeah.
Wow. And then when was the time that you really gave your life to Christ? You started living for Christ?
Yeah, so then after we left Atlanta, the NFL stands for not for long. So after Atlanta, then Green Bay, Dad went with the Packers. And then we moved to Louisiana. My mother is from that area right there on the Mississippi River, Natchez, Mississippi, Faraday, Louisiana, central Mississippi, Louisiana. And we built a lake house. Actually, it was our home on a lake. And two people, our neighbors, Peggy and Jack Benson, began to invite me to go to First Baptist Church in Natchez, Mississippi. And there I would publicly confess Christ in that Southern Baptist church.
Wow.
Old, long, probably 150, 200-year-old church. And then in college, I went to LSU. I'm now playing football at LSU. And when you're at LSU, man, it's hard to stay in church. It's hard to stay in a walk with the Lord. I mean, playing college football and playing at LSU, I mean, Louisiana has its issues, and one of them is alcohol.
Right.
And just that whole party scene, that whole Mardi Gras world. And it's quite a partying campus. And then January the 10th, 1987. So I know at 14 who Jesus is. At 18, 17, I publicly confessed Christ in church, and I'm water baptized. But now, that junior year, I'm on a deer stand, and the Lord just literally, today will be the greatest day of your life, and you'll never be the same after this day.
Wow.
And I knew by then I was called to ministry. It was my junior year. We had just finished playing in the Sugar Bowl and partying pretty hard, and really not intentional about my walk and serving the Lord with intentionality. And that phrase, those two phrases actually, today will be the greatest day of your life, you'll never be the same, not knowing what would happen, but 2 hours later I'm at a hospital where my father was now brought to the hospital with a heart attack, and he would die that day. But those words became my lifeline. God spoke to me that day. And even though I lost my earthly father, the heavenly Father was so there and so present. And honestly, January the 10th, 1987 is the day that that's when I drew the lines in the sand that day. And
wow.
Went back to LSU my senior year, and maybe had an intention. I'd love to have played in the NFL, but by then my heart was different, and my feet were really slow. So it all kind of worked out to maybe if my feet were faster, I would have maybe played in the NFL. But I knew God was opening the door to start preaching, and I went back and really became the chaplain of the football team, and really spoke to a lot of not just the football, but fraternities, and God began to just open up some doors, and man, just began to preach. And that was in the spring of that fall of my last year, fall of 87, 88. God just began to open up doors, and been doing it ever since.
Amazing.
Just keep preaching and telling people about Jesus, and somehow I get paid to do this.
That's amazing. Amazing. And Pastor Joe, I've had the privilege to see from a distance the call of God on your life from when God called you to Austin, and see you just start literally with nothing.
Yeah.
And it's awesome to be able to see. It's so encouraging. I think it can really encourage pastors and leaders wherever they are today, because I got to see you start with nothing, and see today a church that is one of the most, if not the most, one of the most influential churches in your city, right on the hill on, is it the I-5 that it's on?
I-35.
I-35. Mm-hmm. And just amazing to see what God is doing with literally thousands of people coming to church every weekend, some of the largest conferences in your area. It's a miracle to see what God has done. Just tell us a little bit about God's call to Austin, and then just what God has done in the last, even in the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, so Lori and I are married in July of 90, and we were youth pastors, and then of that same church in New Orleans, we were later on co-pastors and youth pastor, and then we became senior pastors of a church in between New Orleans and Baton Rouge for 5 years. And then in 98, began to travel full-time, living out of Baton Rouge area. So those 10 years, 11 years, I was in New Orleans pastoring and then senior pastoring. And in that spring of 2000, we began to pray, Lord, if you want us to plant a church, and this is before the organization that we helped start called ARC, the Association of Related Churches. So ARC had yet been formed, but we began to sense, Lord, if you want us to plant a church, tell us what city to go to, and we'll spend the rest of our life there.
Wow.
What I would describe as the second most dramatic day of my life, the first being the day my dad died, and hearing that word. This was a spring Sunday morning. I'm preaching, getting ready to preach actually in a church, and all of a sudden the thought came, and I know where it came from. Out of the blue and out of heaven came, it is Austin.
Wow.
Told Lori as I was driving home from that church. I called her on the cell phone, and she said the same thing happened to me. She goes, I was sitting here reading my Bible, and I had the thought just entered into my spirit that we were moving to Austin. We took a trip there a couple weeks later, and then we moved there about 4 months later, arrived August the 10th, and we started the church October the 1st. And I would not recommend anyone planning a church after about 40 days of arrival, because we had no lead team. We had nothing. We had no dream team. It was a nightmare. But I'm telling you, here we are 19 years later.
I heard a story one time you told about this really nice couple that moved in next to you or something, and you went to bring them cookies.
Yeah.
And then found out that they were
also... It was, when you're a church planner or when you're hungry to reach people for the gospel, everybody's a target, everybody's a candidate. Yeah. And so we saw this family across the street, and they saw us, and man, we're thinking, wow, okay, this is good. We could use these people. They look normal. And not to say that some people in churches don't, but these people looked really normal. Well, they came across the street as soon as we moved in, just a couple of days after being in. They came across the street, and they got cookies. And I was like, wow, not only are we going to get a new member to come and be a part of our new church, but we're getting fed. I mean, this is God. And they standing there at the front door, hey, we're the so-and-sos, and we saw you move in, and we just wanted to come over and bring you cookies. And I said, oh, man, thank you. And my hands are on the cookie sheet. And as they're asking us, so what brought you to Austin? I said, well, we're planning a church. And it went cold and went silent. And those cookies that I was about to take from her began to come back to her life. And she goes, well, that's what we're here to do. We're planning a church as well. And I don't remember if we got to keep the cookies or not, but she took, I don't know what happened, but they turned around and left pretty quick. And in fact, the funny thing about that same family, they were planning a church. They were probably a year into it. We found out even from people that would later join our church how they would make fun of us because we were starting our church within, relatively a couple of weeks, and they were mocking us and laughing at us. And make a long story short, they ended up resigning from their church about 2 years later. And I think they still live in the city. And then 19 years later, we've, seen what we've seen.
Right.
Anyway, it taught us to, you got to keep a big spirit.
Right. And you started, tell us about your first day and your first couple of weeks in church planting. And
yeah, we were in a little library, little 2-room, it was a conference center connected to a public library just north of Austin. And one room was for the adults and one room was for the kids. And Lori played keyboard while I would lead worship. And then when we finished with the worship, Lori got up from the keyboard and then went over and went into the next room and started working with the kids. So the kids were almost by themselves during worship service. And maybe our boy, who was at the time 9, was probably running the children's ministry. And then I'd bang on the wall, and then Lori would come back over and help me close out the service some 3 hours later. Back in the day, it was a long, bad service. We had 54 people our first Sunday, got down to about 7. After 1 year, we had about 70, maybe 80 people. And then it never went below that. And then we started getting a little bit more traction, found a little building, moved into a little storefront, 6,000 square foot, rented facility in an industrial plex. It was a 30 by, no, 3, yeah, it was 60 by 40, the sanctuary. And we just crammed in a bunch of chairs, and we actually grew to about 1,000 plus people in that little room.
Wow.
And God just started sending people out of nowhere. And it had to be God because we were in nowhere. We had no website. We had no media. We had no social. We had no platform. We had nothing. And God just began to bring people. And then one day said crazily, let's believe God for 100 acres on I-35. And by then we'd already been in one little school up the road. So we had a couple of campuses. And then 100 acres, we bought 110 acres on I-35. And we've built now three major rooms. The first room was about 900, and then a 1,400, and then we have now been over 2 years. Our latest building was a 3,000 seater, And so we've built on about probably 60 acres of the 110.
Wow.
And now we're taking the older or the first buildings and turning those into what is our college, our university.
Yep.
And so, yeah, it's been 19 years in August.
Amazing.
And, I think part of it is you just don't quit. I mean, you got to have something to say, and you got to, obviously, through prayer and through fasting and trusting God, but a lot of it is, as the Bible talks about, not throwing away your confidence, because there were days when you had no confidence. I had no confidence in my message. Lori had no confidence in my message. It was kids had no confidence in my message. Really, as a senior pastor, nobody had any confidence, and at times, you just keep going. In fact, one Sunday morning it was so bad I just stopped in the middle of the service and I said, "This is the worst message I've ever heard in my life," and I'm preaching it, and I don't blame you if you'll never come back. And that's when Lori walked out with the kids, and jokingly they did not, but Lori met me after and she said, "Don't you ever say that again." Wow. I said, "Well, it was the truth. It was. You had to agree. It was a horrible message." In fact, I think that Sunday I was trying to do what Rick Warren did and other friends, Chris Hodges, the fill in the blank.
Okay.
And I just couldn't find the rhythm to hit the blank.
Right.
And it was just all horrible and borrowed and pretending. And then I realized that day I got to stay in my lane and be who I am. And
that's a great lesson, isn't it? I think we all learned that one the hard way, unfortunately. But how did you figure? I mean, obviously through that thing, but there's so many different personalities in the body of Christ, so many different kinds of ministry, different gifts. How did you settle into who you are and who God called you to be and what God called you to do in your city? How did you know that?
Maybe the verse that I have used often for pastors and especially church planners, the first verses in the book of Luke. Luke writes, "Inasmuch as many have taken into an account to compile the things that Jesus was doing." He goes, "It seemed good to me, after carefully investigated everything, that I would write out into consecutive order."
Right.
My experience, my history. In other words, what he was saying is, I could fall into this comparison trap. I could compare what you could say, what Mark wrote, or what John wrote, or what Matthew wrote. But Luke goes, but I know I have had a history with God that is very different maybe than what those guys have had. And I think we always have to come back to our own history. And I think you got to have a history. You got to have when we talk about whether it's a quiet time or a private life or your prayer closet or even just how you live your life in front of the Lord. If you don't have that, then you won't have a history. Yep. You won't have you won't have anything to say. Not to say that we're all sum totals of people's voices.
Totally.
Nothing's new under the sun. Just when you think you got a revelation, trust me, it's been preached by the Puritans in the 1400s, or someone has preached thought that you are thinking you've discovered something. But you've got to come back to what Luke said, and that is, man, I have been with Jesus. I've been with my Bible, and I've also I have developed a personal history, and I've learned what it means to walk with God, and so
those things are interesting. Like even when they in Acts, when they sent out Paul and Barnabas, some of the wording is really interesting in there, where it says, "It seemed good to us," and to the Holy Spirit. It's kind of the way they said it.
That's right. And that's what Luke said. It seemed good to me. And there are some days, frankly, in every decision you make, there is going to be that element of faith, or the requirement of faith, which means I don't know, or I'm not sure. It just seems like God. So if anybody says, I have 100% heard from the Lord, or I have 100% assurance, well, then now you don't need faith.
Right.
And Paul says, now you're not walking by hope, and hope that has been revealed, or that which you're hoping for, if it's been revealed, is no longer hope. And so it's always it's a faith walk. It's a faith journey. Amazing. And I feel like even though we know the Lord is going to provide, or we know that the Lord has spoken to us, or we have enough history with God to know that seems to be his voice, that seems to be the way he led me in the past. I've had these hints, these whispers, these winks, but then there's still going to be a walking out of whatever that is by faith, and
Right.
you just don't know
And
the
have
unknown.
have you ever stepped out in that and then wondered after the fact that you stepped out, like, man,
Yeah.
did I miss it?
Yeah, even right now at this
Yeah.
podcast,
Yeah.
leaving the hotel. God, am I in your will? I'm still trying to figure that out. It's, yes, there's been, we had a campus, we opened up, it was a portable campus in South Austin, and it was great. It ran its course for a season and a time, and, even Jesus went into cities and he goes, okay, guys, we're not getting the receptive or
Right.
the reception that we thought.
Right.
Let's dust our
Feet.
feet off and move on down the road.
Yep.
But let's not quit. So
Right.
you pick up and you go down. Even Jesus did
Wow,
not
that's
say,
so good.
hey, this is 100%, or this is the way that we're going to be received in that city. No, he just said, okay, let's go, boys. Let's pick it up. And because there's going to be people that God is going to, Spurgeon talks about the providence of God and the free will of man. And we have to understand it is both.
Right.
And someone asked Spurgeon, how do you reconcile providence and the will of man? He goes, I never try to reconcile friends. In other words, you don't reconcile.
Right.
If you're really a friend, you don't need to be reconciling friends.
Right.
That's what friends are. They're together. Well, in the same way with God, there has to be this understanding that God works providentially, but he also works with man's will and response. And so it's
Wonderful.
just a balance.
I just think people can be encouraged today that wherever they are, keep going, keep moving. God's for you. Maybe you stepped out in faith and are wondering about it. Don't wonder about it anymore. Just keep moving and what God has for you.
Absolutely.
wonderful.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's half the battle, as my pastor Mel Davis says, is just showing up. It's just keep showing up. But
Wonderful.
you also got to do your homework. Even in Luke 1, he did step out and compile an account. He wrote the book of Luke.
Right.
He wrote Acts. But he said, I carefully investigated everything.
Right.
I really did my homework. So when someone says to me, well, Joe, I'm going to do what you did, I'm going to step out. I said, well, be careful. We pastored 10 years in Louisiana. We senior pastored. We'd always had a measure of success. We had something proven.
Right.
And a lot of people, they get a good bowl of cereal and they take that as a prophetic word of
Right.
God. And all the Lord was saying was that was a good bowl of cereal,
Sure.
not plant a church. And
You got to be faithful in the small things.
and you gotta have
and in every one of those steps along the way.
yep, and you gotta have wise counsels
Yeah.
and counselors and
Well, tell me about that a little bit. I want to kind of just switch gears a bit because you mentioned your pastor, Pastor Mel Davis, who happens to be kind of my spiritual grandfather. My dad, Pastor Davis, has been his pastor for over 40 years. And so that's kind of how we've been interconnected for so long. But just tell me about your relationship with Pastor Davis, what that means to you, how he has helped you through
Yeah.
these different seasons of life. And
yeah, God. When I heard him speak the first time, I was in New Orleans, Louisiana, sitting on the back row of that church. Didn't know anyone in this pastor's conference, and I, listening to him, said, "Man, I believe that could be my mentor, my spiritual father, my pastor. But I want more of that voice. I want more of his wisdom." And then I saw him again at another pastor's conference, and actually the little fellowship that we were part of pastors. He was a regular speaker, and then I'd go up to him, and then one day we had lunch, and then we became senior pastors, and then I had him come in. And so I've had to pursue. I think
Yep.
that's something that you have to understand in that pastor role, or when you're as a pastor looking to your pastor,
Yep.
that there's a responsibility of making that call, making that pursuit.
Right.
Elisha Elisha pursued Elijah.
Right.
And even Elijah said, hey, you stay here, I'm going here. And it looked like he was trying to ditch him. It looked like he was trying to get away from him. And part of that is what you have to go through. You have to pursue. Another voice in my life is John Maxwell, who many, of course, know John's works and leadership books, and he mentors me, and we're very, very close. But I have to call John. Yeah. But with Mel, in major transitions, major decisions, he's been there. He's gone ahead of us. He's now in his late 80s, and he can just drop more wisdom and perspective.
Right.
And of course, I don't believe there's anybody in the world that can make the Bible come more alive than Pastor Davis. And so, just his presence as a father, grandfather, his wisdom that it's going to be okay, and then also helping us make some critical decisions as it relates to relationships and even his own history and experiences of people that he's been hurt by. Or people that might have stayed too long in his life. He helped us cut free of people that I think he saw. All right, I see this same pattern, Joe. It's time to let them go, or it's time to make a shift. So it's just been massive. We are where we are today because of Mel in many ways, not just in his teaching or in his example, but in his prophetic word. But at the same time, he doesn't tell us what to do.
Right.
I don't call him to put on him a responsibility or a burden. But if nothing else, it's just knowing that you're connected to an anchor of the faith.
Yep.
You know, when Paul was in that boat, when they were all in that boat there in Acts 27, they dropped those anchors. You know, and we all need to be able to go to those anchors,
right,
and just kind of go, okay, I'm not crazy. Or even if you feel like you're going crazy, they help you get off the crazy train.
Yep. So, so we're talking about, we're kind of talking for a minute about ministry because, I've always been taught every pastor needs a pastor. You need accountability. You need covering. You need someone who will pray with you, all those things like that. And I believe in that. Of course, I live that with you in our lives, and we're so thankful for you. But just, you've been a senior pastor in Austin and then in Louisiana. People come to church. You are their pastor. What should they lean into? I'm just talking to a business person. They come to church. What should they be leaning into to receive from their pastor, to get as much out of them as they can? And of course, as the church grows, as it has in Austin, as it has here in Red Deer, sometimes you have less personal relationship with your pastor. It becomes less frequent to talk to them, but you can still lean in and receive what you need in the context of a larger church.
Well, it's interesting that you're saying that. This morning I got a direct message on Instagram. And I'll read this to you because it's actually perfect segue. It just says, "Hey, Pastor Joe, not sure if you remember us." And they mention their names. We've been with Celebration since the good old days at Chisholm Trail, which was in that little bitty 6,000 square foot facility. My husband and I recently ventured off and tried a new church for a few months. Initially, it was good. It was a small church in a shopping center, much like what we were a part of back in the day with Celebration, where everyone knew and got to meet everyone, and it had that wonderful small feel to it that we missed at Celebration as Celebration grew and grew. Now, one of the things that we talk a lot about in our staff and even in our church is, despite that our growth has come, we still work hard at
small church with a lot of people in
exactly.
It. Yep.
And so she's saying this, and I get it, but that's as a result of them. That's
right.
We're not any different. Yeah, there's more people here, but she allowed the growth to knock them off their game. And so she goes, after a month into this new church, we started noticing some red flags. The kind that you would joke about at church, the red flags that you don't stick around to question, you just get up and go.
Right.
We reached out to one of your pastors, and they actually asked us to serve on in a dream team role, helping kids go to their middle school camp, which we just had this last week. And they said the first time we're back at Celebration, we're already back serving. And of course, so many faces and hugs. It was as though we never left. And she said, stepping away for a few months really made us miss and appreciate our church.
Wow.
We got into the car, looked at each other, and said, this is home. This is where we belong. It's ignited a fire for us to get back involved. And if I can't find a small group, well, guess what? Like you always say, Pastor Joe, we're just going to start one. Thank you, Pastor, for your passion for the church and being authentic. I don't want to ever speak badly about another church, but it has truly been an experience that led us back home. And I think that we have to make sure that we're committed to excellence. We're committed to doing things right. Like Jesus, he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. We've got to be consistent in our life, in our leadership. The culture has to maintain a standard that is very much, if you want to say it like this, predictable.
Right.
And, people go and people come. And we have this happen a lot as the church has grown.
Yep.
There's about 15,000 people in our church now. And we do lose people who say, I just wish it was back. What they're basically saying is, I used to have more attention. I used to get more attention. I used to get your attention, Pastor Joe.
Right.
Well, frankly, my son said that when we brought our second son home from the hospital after Lori gave birth to Connor. He goes, I was a really good and happy kid until you brought the second one home. Now you're making me mad.
Right.
And I have to give up my toys, and I'm aggravated. And I said, well, that's exactly why God brings people to churches. Number one, of course, he wants to build the family, but number two, it makes the old ones grow up and mature. And we see this a lot where people go and that's great. And some people do find another spot or help plant a church, which is, the way that God does it. And hopefully we've impacted people to where they are a blessing to a new church plant. But a lot of people are not called to move.
Right.
And they're not called to float. And obviously, there are a lot of Tarzan Christians.
Those are planted in the house.
Yeah, Tarzan Christians.
And it's funny how, if you're in the vision of the house and you're believing God for the city to be one, and then you're upset.
Yeah, we have people go, Pastor Joe, it's just become too big. I said, okay, so what do you want me to start doing? What dysfunctional thing, what stupid thing, what's the first stupid thing we should start doing so that we will keep people from coming?
Yeah.
And maybe that first stupid thing is to put you at the front door. How about that? And then you can stand up there and say, don't come. How about the first stupid decision I make now is to make you a dream team member? Anyway, what are you going to do? People are sheep, but at the same time, we know that
I just think it's so important that when people are part of the house and you have a vision and you want to be a part of a big vision, then it really is a sign of maturity in a believer when the vision starts to happen. And that might even mean like you look at John the Baptist. It was a sign of incredible maturity that he said that I would decrease, that he may increase. And I'm going to be large in my spirit so that the church can expand and go forward and we can see our city won to Christ. And
yeah, that's exactly right. And in that context of John 11, he was offended, but people were being healed. The lame were walking, the blind were seeing, but John's in prison. And of course, Jesus said, hey, tell John, don't be offended that others are seeing what he helped build and what he helped set up. And a lot of, especially in today's world of ministry and a lot of, in today's world of instant information that we can all find out about from people, whether it's in the church or out of the church, we're all quick to judge, and we're all quick to examine and falsely judge and falsely examine our lives. Well, we're not doing as much as this person's doing, and we get offended or we feel left out, and that's why it always has to come back to the man, Christ Jesus. Has to be your motivation, the relationship to Him. I didn't get into this. I didn't start following the Lord so I could be in ministry.
Right.
I didn't start reading my Bible so I could be a preacher.
Yep.
I read my Bible because I love Jesus and His Word is alive, and so ministry has to flow out of that that healthy relationship of Christ.
So good.
If that's not healthy, I'm going to tell you, ministry will jack you up.
Right.
And you will want to just literally, we see it every day. People, look at Judas. I mean, his access and his proximity to Christ, it messed him up.
Right.
That's why I said it'd been better for this guy to never been born. And I think in some ways, it's better that some people just don't ever enter into the ministry, because it'll if you're not qualified, if you're not called to it, and if you're not foundationally healthy, it'll throw you into a spiral and a tailspin. And boy, the next thing you know, you could be walking away from Christ.
Yep. Totally.
Boy, that's a real positive.
This is such a positive podcast
yeah,
right
God
now.
bless you all.
Moment.
Shut it down.
Let me ask you two more questions. All right, so we're just talking about church and for a minute, what should you expect of your pastor, or what should church life change to? And I just want to encourage every person, wherever you are, just continue to love Jesus. And as change happens in your church, wherever it is, and be excited about that. Like, be thrilled about it, and you might need to find like a new place that God would open up a new door for you.
Absolutely.
You don't have to stay in the same spot for 30 years if that's not what you're called to do. And I think that, as the church grows, that should actually make us excited, give us more opportunity to minister to people. And really, at the end of the day, if we're celebrating the people that are in the baptism tank and those that are putting up their hands to receive Christ, man, we should be the happiest people alive.
Yeah.
This last month, I got to put 2 people in the baptismal tank myself. Beautiful. And that brought so much life and joy into my world this month, just by doing what Jesus told us to do, to make a disciple, right?
Absolutely. And even Jesus, when the disciples came back from a ministry day and they saw Satan fall like lightning and saw dramatic fruit and powerful manifestations of God, he goes, guys, don't rejoice in that, because that all can change. In fact, it will change. There'll be days when you're going to go out and you're going to get your butt killed. Yep. And Satan's going to be saying, I saw disciples fall like Satan. But he goes, rejoice that your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. Rejoice that your name is in the book. Right. Don't rejoice in ministry. Don't rejoice in how you're being used. Don't find your identity in that. Find that your identity is in the Lamb's Book, that you're one with me, that you know me, and you're ever learning knowing me. So wonderful. If we're not careful, especially in ministry or in people who are aspiring to be in ministry, which is a good thing, don't approach God and don't just use God so that you can be more productive in ministry. Right. Let the ministry flow out. Let God open those doors, and then that way, when things do change, or when you're asked to sit instead of speak, you're good with it. Yep. You're just healthy because your goal is Christ.
So good. Well, Pastor Joe, with one more question, and then we'll close this out. But so you've seen all this amazing things happen at Celebration. You're part of our church here at Home Church, as you're backing our pastors, and you're part of ARC, which is really growing across the United States and Canada, and different parts of the world. What are you most excited about when you think about your future, the future of Celebration Church, the future of our church here in Canada? What just makes you excited about what God's doing?
Well, I think that we have greater challenges like never before, but we also have greater opportunities like never before, where there's, as the scripture says, where there's sin, grace the more, that God can actually, in our challenges, begin to show up in a supernatural way. I feel like in some ways the exposure of the real church, the genuine church, the real believers versus the false believers, with greater and greater social pressures, with the attacks on the scriptures as it relates to various social situations that we're facing. The definitions, whether that be of home or marriage or life or gender, all of those things, frankly, are exposing It's kind of it's difficult. It's a double-edged sword, but it's going to expose. And I just think that when there is that kind of shaking and that kind of exposure going on, God begins to do some really neat things. So he says, when you see trials and when you see tribulations and when you see pressure coming on you, look up. This is starting to get good now.
Right.
Let's face it, every good game, real good games, really get good in the last quarter. We're in that last quarter.
So true.
We're in that last. I mean, there's a lot of things that could happen in the last minutes of any game. In fact, we play a board game at home now. It is boring for the first hour, and then all of a sudden, as the thing comes down to an end, Lori and I are fighting, and the kids are fighting, but it's a fun fight, and this rush kicks in, and I just feel like we're in that rush.
Right.
I feel like we're hitting that rush now, and I'm actually more excited now in the midst of all of this, because God can do His best work, even in the midst of messes. That's
awesome.
What He specializes in. So I'm really encouraged. The church, in some ways, is becoming younger, and at 55, I feel younger than my kids do. I tell them that you guys look old. I look younger than you. So anyway, I just think
wonderful.
The Spirit is moving.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you, Pastor Joe, for being with us today. I want to encourage everyone to hit subscribe this podcast. Also, if you put it on your social media, on your Instagram or Facebook or other social media platforms, and just get this out. I'd love lots of people to be able to hear this and get as much out of it as you can. And so God bless you today, and we just pray God's very best for you in this season of your life, your church, what God's doing with you. Thanks for being with us.